20 minutes for 6 discussants. So we have 3 minutes, 6 over that. I'm sorry for that. Starting with Sang-Ming Chen, which is the Dean and the Director of Global and Urban Studies at Trinity College Office. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start just try to revisiting the two themes of this session that Saskia started. The global urban context and the issue of inclusion. Trying to make a connection points and drawing from a little bit of the evidence from Shanghai, the city that I know best, that's often used as an example, sort of almost an exception to the other urban age cities as where the state matters the most in terms of creating and building a global city, and also connecting to what's happening as we speak on the ground in Shanghai and the other booming manufacturing cities in China. Saskia mentioned about this point about cities becoming very specialized, they occupy different segments on the global circuits. I think that's a very important point that bears elaboration, illustrated by where Shanghai is on that global production network and how that affects different global cities differently. The premise of urban age, cities becoming more important players in the global economy where the nation state may be losing some of the power. But here we're also seeing even these mega globalizing cities are very, very vulnerable to the attack of the economy. Just recently, we've seen the news coming out of China. There's millions of the migrant workers in Shanghai, a place like Shenzhen, have been forced to return home. The estimated figures are 20 to 30 million of these migrants who work on the construction sites, on the factory floors. So if you're thinking about a city like Shanghai, it's not so much the buildings that we see, it's actually the massive millions of people who are making up this rapid growth of the cities. So what has happened is that the impact of globalization doesn't stop at the city. The impact lengthens beyond the global city back to the countryside. And as these migrants go back home, what they found, they're entering a very unfamiliar hostile environment because many of them have never really farmed. They start out moving to the cities, working on construction sites, and working in the restaurants. So many of them found they cannot survive back in the countryside and are forced perhaps to drift back to the cities when there's very fewer jobs and may have to end up in the informal sector. So here we see an irony. Even in the context like China, where the state is increasingly aware of the importance of the migrants and trying to accommodate, but increasingly incapable of dealing with the impact of globalization, which are much more powerful than the state being able to deal with that challenge.
Thank you. Please, Jerry Frank.
So there's a lot of discussion about metropolitan government here, and I think the question we should think about is how we could make progress on that. What's left out so far is the history in Brazil that metropolitan government was a federal responsibility under the military rule, and it was understood as centralized government, top-down centralized government. So the 88 Constitution changed that idea by transferring it to the state, but it's still understood as centralized government, and to the extent that regional government is understood as one more form of centralized government, it's unlikely to be supported by the people within the region. So I think we need to start thinking about metropolitan government another way. And the other way is to think about the city's own power to control its own destiny. And actually, cities are much weaker about their own population and their own destiny than people realize. For example, if you talk about crime and health, two issues that are talked about in Ned's presentation one should recognize it's the state, not the city, that runs the police. Here in Sao Paulo, the state is a powerful actor in the health services. So here's a method of thinking about metropolitanization. This is the deal. We will give cities more power if they work together. We will give cities more power if they cooperate with each other. And that offer needs to be made by the state and federal governments. We have a problem here in Brazil, which is a lot of the structure of current metropolitan government and local government was put into the Constitution in 1988. Nothing in 2008 is the same as it was in 1988. If we have to amend the Constitution every time we change municipal government, we're in trouble. So we need to think about how to organize an effort to change the power structure so that the state, city, and the federal relationship is very different within the current constitutional structure.
Thank you very much, Dieter.
I would like to take up a question which was put forward by the organizers. What could be the emerging lessons from the financial crisis? I like very much Saskia's talk, especially to emphasize the diversity of the circuits and the varieties of the different cities. I think it's right that the financial crisis will be even more severe. There are new financial innovations, as swaps, the collaborated debt application, distributing uncontrollable risk around the world. But I think I would add an additional problem. The counterpart to the financial crisis, in my sense, is the deep crisis of an overstretched forest. An overstretched condition which was made possible by the strategy of always cheaper money, state debt, debt-taxation, and which it has in heart the private house ownership in suburban areas with a very high rate high level of indebtedness, the collapse of the traditional car, mass production, the crisis of the mass consumption. So what I would like to say is we cannot hope that the crisis will be overcome by some regulation. So the cities will have to face a very volatile, very fragile future. So what would be the answer of the city? The cities, that would be, I would put forward the notion, we should look forward to the resilient city. A city which can adapt, which is robust, which can adapt to an unstable environment. So on one hand we see that we come from a global hierarchy to a more global centrality, which gives chances. We have to come from standardization, homogenization to specification. We have to come from quantity to quality, from efficiency to adaptability. And at one point I would like to add that we should try to reintegrate production to the cities and city regions as inbuilt stabilizers in a social and economic sense. Forms of urban manufacturing you very often emphasized, but also we have to reflect on questioned perspectives of urban agriculture. So we have to reintegrate value change, to get a more robust structure, of the urban regional economy to function, go on functioning in a ongoing global world. For we really have to save the globalization by restabilizing the cities.
Dieter said it very clearly. I totally agree. And I am working on questions like urban agriculture and urban manufacturing. And I tried in my presentation to make scale. If a city has a large scale, it has to maximize the potential for diversity. And I did not mention urban manufacturing, but it's sort of one of my adorable topics. I love that topic. And urban agriculture is another. So I totally agree. There's a lot of it. I really think that we should leave the time for the discussions.
Thank you very much. I'll make a comment, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to build on this by making the point that there are probably 10 significant economic impacts of the world financial crisis that we see. And I'd like to suggest that we move beyond talking about it as a financial crisis, but rather as an economic crisis. Specifically, urban economic structure is changing. Reduction in credit will affect investment, consumption, and urban employment. Demand will go down. Urban economies are likely to contract, as we've seen, for example, in the beginning as we saw, for example, Argentina. We'll see a shift in the consumption, in the composition of activity, away from manufacturing. We've already seen the car question. But we'll also see it in the repair industry, in marketing and advertising. I would suggest, as a question, will we see more informality or not? Question. Second point, on the overall distribution of income, we know from studies here in Brazil and other parts of Latin America that when economic growth goes up, the poor improve their conditions. But when economic growth goes down, the poor go further down and they stay down longer. So I would suggest widening gaps in the income distribution, urban inequality will increase. With reduced commodity prices, particularly in the rural sector, some people will move off the land. Migration will accelerate in some places, even though it has been tended to stabilize in other places. We've seen in the last couple of years food and energy problems in terms of pricing. Well, food and energy prices are going down, but the problem is that people won't have the income to pay for them. So we will see problems of urban malnutrition, which will affect the real economy. We're already seeing that in some parts of the world. So, reduced production, reduced trade, reduced consumption. That will affect the public sector. There will be reduced tax revenues. With fewer public revenues, there will be less money for infrastructure, for social services. We're going to enter what I would say the new age of adjustment, but it's not the adjustment that comes from the Washington Consensus. It comes from a global economy which is now imposed at the city level on specific countries. At the municipal level, we will see deferred maintenance. We will increase the risk of infrastructure failure through deferred maintenance. And there will be more vulnerability of the economy to failed infrastructure. Katrinas all over. All of this comes through what I would say is a pattern of cumulative causation. There are wonderful econometric studies in the States showing how when one variable changes, for example, interest rates, there are a whole series of cascading effects. So we're entering an era of cumulative economic changes in the city, and this raises a wide variety of questions that I would just suggest to this group we really need to study and learn about in a much more serious way. Finally, for urban form, I think the result is with a weaker public sector, there will be more slums, there will be more people unlinked to infrastructure networks, more informality, less urban citizenship, with increasing numbers of people living unconnected to public institutions, which will be weak. It's not a happy picture, but it seems to me that even though there's a general view that cities can be resilient, that we do see differential performance, there are a set of common questions that we need to study across the cities in order to understand how these factors actually play out and how they actually interact with the circuits which Saskia described. Finally, I would argue that we're in an urban age. It's an age of possibility, but it's increasingly an age of urban risk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you. I think that I would like to stress is the importance of dynamic studies. Europe and so on, figures we've had in China, to 7% and below. China exports to the United States. The United States had so huge indebtedness that had to put down, and in terms of next year, the type of adjustment in consumer spending and the indebtedness possibilities is just absolutely not seen in this century, in modern times. In this depression, the globalization will be another thing. Tax will be different. In Brazil, to take an example, we are coming from 5% growth, perhaps to 2%. Next quarter will be a disaster in terms of unemployment, and it's not different from the rest of the world. Therefore, in a growth cycle, growth integrates and coordinates actions of cities and mainly large metropolitan areas, not only to achieve full gains of scale, but mainly for cities to absorb externalities, gains from externalities that single cities do not achieve, even the largest ones. And yet, in recession, when the growth phase develops into recession, this is the point where governance might make a huge difference. In expansions, the expansion itself, development dynamics, conducts coordination among cities, in metropolitan regions, among metropolitan regions, and in the global rings. We are in a circuit break of these global rings. They're broken. Where they are not broken, they are an energy saving type of development. Therefore, governance seems to be, it's very important in the reaction to the recession. If you take São Paulo, which is 1/3 of the national GDP, 40% of industrial production, and you take the metropolitan regions of Campinas and Santos, these expanded metropolitan areas represent 70% of the population of the state, 70% of the state GDP, and therefore more than 25% of the national GDP. Less than 0.5%, 0.33% of the national area is responsible for 27% of the national GDP. The institutions which are in place and which allow interaction between federal, state and local municipalities and the metropolitan regions have to be precisely better, improved for the adequate governance of these countries and these large metropolitan areas in recessions.
No time to thank, no time to justify why I will talk in English. So, let's take the financial crisis and the discussion on that as an opportunity. I think we can see that as an opportunity to finally implement an urban reform in São Paulo, in Brazil, in our cities. And I think if we see that as a sign, as a start of a failure of a model, we can maybe think on different ways. So let's just briefly see how much globalization and neoliberalism had impact urban policies and urban shape and the disorder that we have in São Paulo. First of all, we have to take into account that the 90s and all the empire of neoliberalism arrived in a model that was already here, that was built during 40s here in our urban development model, which was basically marked by territorial exclusion of the poor, and that has a lot to do with urban sprawl and that has a lot to do with the form of inequality, the very specific form of inequality that we do have here. And part of it is that never, ever, housing was part of the cost of the labor force. Never. So this city was basically built by the people themselves without any resources. Then second, when globalization came, then we had a very important impact on that, because precisely what Saskia was saying, the financiarization of real estate, the financiarization of housing, the commodification of the city, and the competition between cities to get some parts, some maps of this international capital flowing over cities and country. So that made urban policies really trying to, in order to attract capital, to create some global parts of the city that could attract that, and that deepened even more here in this city inequality and segregation. So I see precisely because of that. So if it's a failure now, if there is no global capital available anymore to do that, then maybe we can rethink on a different model of city. And just to finish that, here in this place where we are now, the city center, downtown São Paulo, we are in the middle of the city, of discussing the future of the city with two options. One option is creating around the corner a huge museum for theater and dance with architects, international architects, Herzog from Nanjing, Minho de Pássaro, designing it in a very old model of globalization and financiarization of real estate, or maybe recreate city here in this place where infrastructure is there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raquel. Saskia wants to react in 30 seconds.
Yes. I want to make three comments very quickly. First, the question of financializing is really serious. For instance, let me just give you some facts. In the United States, and this is a ratio, this is not share, financial assets. And remember, finance is about debt. Banking is you have the money and you sell it. Finance is you don't have the money, but you're going to get there. 450%. The value of financial assets in the United States as a ratio is 450% to GDP. Second item, our Federal Reserve Bank is right now committed, not actually put out the money, 50 to 1. It is leveraged 50 to 1. That is unsustainable. We are headed to a systemic crisis of severe proportions. Now, there it then comes. I just wrote a piece about this that I'll put on the website or whatever. What we have done in the United States is opt for a financial solution to a financial crisis. Whatever money we put into the system feeds the milk of finance. It's a radical mistake. Anyhow, I could go on and on, but I won't. Now, second point, there are differences. I understand from Swilly, Schiffer, Ramos, that for instance, in this city, mortgages are not so common. People actually own their households. They are not caught. And I also want to recover those global servants, those that have resisted this globalizing of finance, etc. Again, this is just one little example. Final point, coming back to the city. We know from all kinds of data that when cities are in crisis, not necessarily financial crisis, but say London was bankrupt in the 70s, New York was officially bankrupt in the 70s, and Tokyo was also bankrupt in the 70s. That's right before the new era begins. That was the time when they had the least inequality. Second point, we know that the modest profit-making firms, the modest income households, if you have vast numbers of them in the city, that means that all that money recirculates in the city. That is critical, and I do think, I thought Michael was totally right, that informality under these conditions begins to be a systemic replacement for those modest middle-income households and firms to support, maintain, reproduce the city. We can stay there, but it is a critical period, and this is actually a systemic replacement. So much more to say, but I get it.
There is so much more to say, and I'm going to say a tiny amount more just to wrap up this morning, in the end of wrapping up this morning. We've had a series of presentations and responses on an array of key urban age themes. We heard from Ricky about the scale and extent of cities as they develop, and the need to consider the way they do indeed expand. From Saskia, we heard about the connectedness of global events and their local impacts that much more. Eduardo, about the way in which government is important, but also the capacity to finance the services that we can come back to at the end. Jerome talked about the need for perhaps less formal mechanisms. Jerry Fruit will talk about this at other points, how these would help delivering better outcomes for the citizens of the city. And then at the end, talked about how understanding what people care about actually helps to direct government effort. If people beyond the government understand what the people who live in the city want, that would be better. I think we've also picked up at the very, very end an extraordinary exchange about the way in which a shortage of global capital may hint at the need for more localised capital. I can see that certainly developing. And of course this interesting shift from the formal to the informal that's also come through. So overall, I think what we've picked up is that the knowledge about global, national and international change, and also about local population needs, is in some ways the key to good governance.
Much has been done, said. Just wanted to stress two stuff. First, I think that many of you have told that we have now an opportunity to accelerate institutional change to provide more affordable governance mechanism now in South America. But we are still very late in this process, how we will strong. And second, that there is an increased demand for flexibility, not only in institutional terms, but also in economical terms. Saskia was very direct to stress that. And we have an handicap in South America in that field. We have an handicap because we have an enormous deficit in terms of human capital. We average schooling of labor force in Sao Paulo is 7 years old. The metropolitan area of Sao Paulo. Almost half of the labor force in Sao Paulo has not achieved primary school. So if we want to have economic diversification, avoiding unemployment and informality in the new scenario, we have to accelerate